There are different kinds of silence. The silence of a church on Sunday morning, heavy with expectation. The silence of a forest at dawn, alive with hidden movement. The silence of a man holding his breath in darkness, listening to voices that should not exist where he stands. In Georgia, 1857, there was a plantation where silence had become something else entirely, a living thing that wrapped itself around the throat of anyone who dared speak the truth. The white columns of Riverside Manor stood 3 stories high, casting shadows that stretched across cotton fields where 200 souls labored under the merciless sun. But it was not in those fields where the most terrible secrets lived. It was in the walls. This is not a story about ghosts or spirits. This is a story about what happens when a man learns things he was never meant to know, and how the very architecture of a house can become a confession chamber for sins that would shake an entire county to its foundations. This is a story about how sound travels through hollow spaces and how some silences are more dangerous than any scream. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from courthouse records, letters found in an attic trunk in 1903, and the sworn testimony of 3 people who were there. The truth of what happened at Riverside Manor was buried for good reason. Perhaps it should have stayed buried, but some stories refuse to remain silent. Samuel was 32 years old the first time he heard the voices in the walls. He had been born on Riverside Manor, as had his mother before him, and he carried the particular kind of quietness that comes from learning early that invisibility is survival. He was not remarkable to look at. Average height, lean from work, with hands scarred from years of carpentry. Master Garrett had recognized his skill with wood when Samuel was barely 14, and since then he had maintained the big house, repairing banisters, fixing loose floorboards, replacing rotted window frames. This was considered good fortune among the enslaved population of Riverside. Housework meant being spared the brutal labor of the fields. It meant better food, cleaner clothes, and most importantly, it meant being unremarkable enough that the white family barely noticed your presence. Samuel had perfected the art of being unremarkable. It was late March when everything changed. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows of the second-floor hallway, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny ghosts. Samuel knelt beside the baseboard in the guest bedroom, investigating a section that had begun to pull away from the wall. The Garretts were hosting a dinner party that evening for neighboring plantation owners, and Mistress Garrett had been very clear that everything must be perfect. Samuel wedged his prior behind the baseboard and gently pulled. The wood came away easily, too easily. Behind it, instead of the solid brick he expected, there was darkness, a hollow space perhaps 6 in deep running along the base of the wall. He had worked on this house for 18 years and never known this cavity existed. Samuel leaned closer, peering into the gap. The hollow appeared to extend in both directions along the wall, and when he turned his head, pressing his ear near the opening, he heard something that made his breath catch. Voices. Not the muffled, indistinct sounds of people in nearby rooms, but clear words as if the speakers were standing right beside him. Yet the guest bedroom was empty and had been all morning. Can't keep this up much longer. A man was saying. Samuel recognized the voice. Master Garrett himself. You don't have a choice. This second voice was unfamiliar, rough, with an accent. Samuel couldn't place. The debt is what it is. You pay or everyone learns how you really acquired this land. Samuel's heart began to pound. He should replace the baseboard and leave immediately. He should forget what he had heard. But his ear remained pressed to that dark gap in the wall, because what came next froze him in place. The shipment arrives next Tuesday, Master Garrett said, and his voice carried a tone Samuel had never heard before. Something close to fear. After that, we'll have enough to satisfy Charleston. But if anyone discovers what we've been, no one will discover anything. The rough voice interrupted. Not unless you're foolish enough to write more of those letters. Footsteps growing fainter, a door closing. Samuel sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He should not have heard that conversation. Master Garrett's study was on the opposite end of the house, separated from this room by the main staircase and at least 40 feet of solid construction. Yet the voices had been perfectly clear, as if channeled through the walls themselves by some trick of architecture. He replaced the baseboard carefully, his hands shaking slightly as he tapped the small nails back into place. When he finished, there was no evidence that anything had been disturbed, but Samuel could not stop thinking about what he had heard. The debt is what it is. Everyone learns how you really acquired this land. The shipment arrives next Tuesday. That evening, as Samuel carried firewood through the back corridors of the big house, he found himself studying the walls with new attention. Riverside Manor had been built in 1791 by Master Garrett's grandfather back when this part of Georgia was still considered frontier territory. The house had been expanded twice, once in 1803 and again in 1829, creating a sprawling structure with odd angles and unexpected spaces. Samuel had always attributed the house's peculiar layout to these additions, but now he wondered if there was more to it. The dinner party that night was loud and long. Samuel stayed in the kitchen quarters, helping to prepare and serve the endless courses that Mistress Garrett demanded, but his mind was elsewhere, turning over the puzzle of those voices in the wall. Samuel began his investigation the next morning, though he could not have explained even to himself exactly what he was investigating. He simply knew that something was wrong at Riverside Manor, something that had been hidden in plain sight for years, perhaps decades. His work gave him access to every part of the house, and he used this freedom carefully. He moved through rooms with his tools, ostensibly checking for loose boards or damaged plaster, but actually examining the walls themselves. He tapped gently on panels, listening for the hollow sound that would indicate empty space behind. He studied the angles where walls met, looking for inconsistencies in the construction. What he discovered was remarkable. The house was full of hollow passages, not large spaces. Most were narrow gaps between the interior and exterior walls, perhaps 6 to 8 in wide, but they formed a network that ran throughout the entire structure, connecting rooms that seemed distant from each other, and more importantly, these passages appeared to have been designed intentionally. At certain points, the gaps widened into small chambers, each one positioned precisely beneath floor vents or beside chimney stacks. Samuel realized he was looking at an acoustic system, a deliberate arrangement that allowed sound to travel through the house in unexpected ways. Someone had built Riverside Manor to carry conversations from one room to another, creating channels where words could flow like water through hidden pipes. But why? The answer came on a Thursday afternoon when Samuel was repairing a cracked window frame in Master Garrett's private study. The master was away in Savannah on business, and Samuel worked alone, carefully removing the damaged wood. As he pulled the frame free, he saw another hollow space behind it, larger this time, perhaps 18 in deep. And inside this space, resting on a small wooden shelf, were papers. Samuel should not have looked. Every instinct cultivated over 32 years of enslavement told him to leave those papers untouched, to replace the window frame, and forget he had seen anything. But his hands moved almost without conscious thought, reaching into that dark space and withdrawing a leather folder tied with string. Inside were letters. The first was dated October 1838, written in elegant handwriting. "Your discretion in this matter has been invaluable. The cargo from Charleston arrived safely, and no one in the county suspects our arrangement. The profit from this venture will clear your debt to the Carolina Consortium within 3 years, provided you maintain absolute silence regarding the true nature of these shipments." Samuel read carefully, his comprehension growing with each page. The letters detailed a business arrangement between Master Garrett and several men in Charleston, something involving shipments that arrived at night, cargo that was never recorded in any official manifest, and profits that were quietly divided among a small group of conspirators. But the letters never explicitly stated what was being shipped. They referred only to cargo and merchandise and the arrangement. There were 12 letters in total, spanning from 1838 to 1856. The most recent one dated just 3 months ago, carried a tone of barely concealed panic. "The investigation in Charleston has made several of us nervous. Senator Williams assures me that no evidence links us to the operation, but I strongly advise burning all correspondence related to our past transactions. If the federal authorities discover what we moved through Georgia in the 40s, none of us will escape prosecution." Samuel returned the letters exactly as he had found them, his mind working furiously. He understood now why Master Garrett had seemed afraid in that overheard conversation. Whatever business he had been involved in, it was illegal and dangerous enough to warrant federal investigation even now, years after the fact. But what was being moved through Riverside Manor, and how did it connect to this house's strange acoustic architecture? Over the following weeks, Samuel mapped the hidden passages with the meticulousness of a surveyor. He worked slowly, careful never to spend too long in any one room or ask questions that might draw attention. But gradually he identified 5 specific locations in the house where the acoustic effect was strongest, places where you could press your ear to a baseboard or air vent and hear conversations from rooms that should have been out of range. The first was in the second-floor guest bedroom, where he had initially discovered the phenomenon. The second was in the small linen closet off the main staircase, which somehow channeled sound from Master Garrett's study with perfect clarity. The third was in the attic behind a loose panel, where voices from the dining room below rose up through a chimney chase. The fourth was in the basement storage room, where a gap in the foundation wall carried sounds from the library on the floor above. The fifth and most disturbing was in the quarters where Samuel himself lived, a small room off the kitchen house. There, in the corner behind his sleeping pallet, a crack in the plaster revealed another hollow space, and through this space he could hear everything spoken in Mistress Garrett's private sitting room directly above. He had been on living beside a listening post for years without knowing it. The realization brought a sick feeling to his stomach. Had someone been listening to him, to the quiet conversations he had with other enslaved people, who sometimes visited his room to his prayers spoken in darkness before sleeping? Or was he meant to be the listener? This last thought came to him late one night as he lay awake, staring at that crack in the plaster. The acoustic passages connected his quarters to the family's private spaces. They allowed him to hear conversations that no enslaved person would normally be permitted to witness. And his position in the house, trusted carpenter with access to every room, gave him both the mobility and the excuse to discover these channels. What if someone had wanted an enslaved person to have this access? What if the house itself was designed to create informants? The thought kept him awake until dawn. Samuel began listening deliberately after that, though the act filled him with equal parts dread and compulsion. He told himself he needed to understand what Master Garrett was involved in, that this knowledge might somehow protect him or the other people who lived and worked at Riverside. But truthfully, he listened because silence had become intolerable. For 32 years he had moved through this house as furniture, as tool, as property. The voices in the walls made him human again, someone capable of witnessing, of knowing, of judging. It was dangerous humanity, but humanity nonetheless. On the first Tuesday in April, Samuel was working in the small linen closet when he heard Master Garrett's voice rising from the study below. "The wagon arrives at midnight. I want everyone away from the east fields. No one sees anything. No one hears anything. What about the house workers?" Another voice. "Mr. Bennett, the plantation overseer, send them to their quarters after supper. No exceptions. And Bennett, make sure the doors to the east wing are locked from the inside. I don't want anyone wondering." Samuel's hands stilled on the shelf he was supposedly repairing. This was it, the shipment mentioned in that overheard conversation weeks ago. That night Samuel lay on his pallet, fully clothed, waiting. The house settled around him with its usual creaks and whispers. At 11:30 he heard footsteps crossing the yard outside. Master Garrett and Mr. Bennett moving toward the east side of the property. Samuel rose and moved to his door. It was locked from the outside as Garrett had ordered, but Samuel had been a carpenter for 18 years, and he knew every floor in every lock in this house. He used a thin piece of metal, slid it into the gap beside the frame, and felt the bolts slide free. The night was moonless and warm. Samuel stayed in the shadows, moving along the edge of the kitchen garden until he reached the split-rail fence that bordered the east fields. From here, he could see the road that led to the river landing and the dark shapes of two wagons making their way slowly up the path. The wagons stopped near a small barn that was used for equipment storage. Master Garrett appeared with a lantern, and in its light, Samuel saw three other men he didn't recognize, rough-looking individuals who moved with the efficient purposefulness of people who had done this many times before. They began unloading the wagons. The cargo was not cotton or tobacco or any legitimate trade good. It was wooden crates, perhaps 24 of them, each one about 3 feet long and unmarked. The men carried them into the barn quickly, speaking in low voices that didn't carry across the field. The entire operation took less than 30 minutes. Then the wagons turned and headed back down toward the river, and the men dispersed. Samuel waited until he was certain they were gone, then crept closer to the barn. The door was secured with a new padlock, but the barn's construction was old and loose. Samuel found a gap between two boards wide enough to peer through. Inside, the crates were stacked against the far wall by the faint starlight coming through the barn's ventilation slats. He could just make out writing stenciled on the sides of several crates, machinery parts, Savannah Foundry. But Samuel knew the Savannah Foundry. He had once repaired furniture for a merchant who supplied them, and he remembered that the foundry marked all legitimate shipments with a registration number and date. These crates had no such markings. Samuel returned to his locked room and slipped back inside, replacing the bolt as carefully as he had released it. He lay awake until dawn, mind churning with questions. What was in those crates? Why were they being hidden at Riverside? And what would Master Garrett do if he discovered that someone had witnessed the delivery? The answer to that last question came sooner than Samuel expected. 2 days after the midnight shipment, a young woman named Ruth was brought to Riverside Manor in chains. She was perhaps 25 years old, thin and exhausted, with a fresh brand on her left shoulder that marked her as a runaway. Master Garrett had purchased her at auction in Augusta, according to the whispered conversation in the kitchen house, and paid an unusually high price, despite her status as a fugitive. Ruth was put to work immediately in the kitchen under the harsh supervision of Mistress Garrett's personal housekeeper. But Samuel noticed something strange. Ruth never spoke, not a single word, even when directly addressed. She communicated only through nods and gestures, and her eyes carried a weariness that went beyond normal fear. On her 3rd day at Riverside, Samuel was repairing a cabinet in the kitchen when Ruth approached him. He glanced around to make sure they were alone, then leaned close and whispered. The first words he had heard her speak, "I know about the walls." Samuel's blood went cold. He forced himself to continue working, keeping his expression neutral. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Ruth's voice was barely audible. "I was here before. 7 years ago, I worked in the laundry house." Samuel set down his hammer carefully. "Why did you come back?" "I didn't have a choice. Master Garrett sent men to find me." Ruth's hands were shaking as she kneaded bread dough, the motion automatic. "They tracked me to Cincinnati. When they brought me back, Master Garrett said if I ever told anyone what I learned in this house, he would make sure I disappeared." "What did you learn?" Ruth shook her head. "Not here. Tonight, your room. Wait until everyone is asleep." She moved away before Samuel could respond, returning to her work with the same mechanical efficiency she had shown since arriving. But Samuel's mind was racing. Ruth had been at Riverside 7 years ago, 1850. That was well within the time frame of the letters he had found, and whatever she knew had been important enough that Master Garrett had spent considerable money and effort to bring her back. That night, long after the house had gone dark and silent, Samuel heard the soft scratch at his door. He opened it to find Ruth standing in the shadows, wrapped in a thin shawl against the cool spring air. "The walls have ears," she said without preamble. "Did you know that the whole house is built to carry sound? Master Garrett's grandfather designed it that way. Samuel gestured her inside and closed the door. Why? To spy on his own family. Ruth moved to the corner where Samuel's pallet lay and pointed to the crack in the plaster, the same crack Samuel had discovered weeks ago. The old master. He was obsessed with knowing everything. He didn't trust his wife, his children, his business partners. So he built a house where he could hear every conversation, every secret. He had listening posts in his study, his bedroom, even his private office in the barn. How do you know this? I found papers. Same as you probably. Ruth's voice was steady now, as if telling the story had given her strength. 7 years ago, I was cleaning in the old master's office. That's the library now, and I knocked over a shelf. Behind it was a journal. The original plans for the house with notes about where the listening passages were located and how to access them. Samuel felt his pulse quicken. What happened to the journal? Master Garrett caught me reading it. Ruth's expression darkened. He was very angry. He took the journal and told me I would be sold immediately if I spoke of it to anyone. But I was young and stupid. I told another woman who worked in the house, thinking we could use this information somehow. Maybe prove that Master Garrett was listening to our conversations. Get him in trouble with the other plantation owners. What did she do? She disappeared. Ruth's voice cracked slightly. 3 days after I told her she was gone, Master Garrett said she'd been sold to a plantation in Florida, but no one ever found record of the sale. She just stopped existing. The small room felt suddenly colder. Samuel thought about the midnight shipments, the crates in the barn, the terrified tone in Master Garrett's letters. That's when I ran, Ruth continued. I made it to Cincinnati, found work, started to think I might actually have a life. But they found me, and Master Garrett brought me back personally just to tell me that I should have kept silent. Why did he keep you alive? I wondered that too. Ruth pulled her shawl tighter. But I think I understand now. He brought me back as a message to everyone in this house. If you learn something you shouldn't, if you try to tell anyone, you end up like me. Branded, broken, a warning. Samuel absorbed this in silence. Then he asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the midnight delivery. What's in those crates? Ruth's eyes widened. You saw them Tuesday night. They unloaded about 24 crates into the east barn. For a long moment, Ruth said nothing. Then I don't know exactly what's in them. But 7 years ago, when I found that journal, there were other papers with it. Shipping manifests, accounts, names of people in Charleston and Savannah. Master Garrett's grandfather wasn't just spying on his family. He was smuggling. Smuggling what? Anything that paid. Furs, tobacco, rum, weapons during the war with Britain. Ruth paused. And people, the word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. You mean enslaved people? Samuel asked slowly. I mean people who were supposed to be free, people who had bought their freedom or been freed by their owners or escaped and made lives in the North. Ruth's voice was shaking now. The journal mentioned reversals. That's what the old master called them. He would work with traders who specialized in kidnapping free black people and bringing them south to be sold back into slavery. The acoustic system in the house let him coordinate these operations without anyone overhearing. He could meet with the traders, make arrangements, plan the kidnappings, all while appearing to be a respectable plantation owner. Samuel felt sick, and Master Garrett continued this. The journal made it seem like it stopped after the old master died in 1842. But now Ruth gestured toward the crack in the wall, toward the network of listening passages that ran throughout the house. If he's receiving shipments in secret, if he's scared enough to track me down after 7 years, maybe it never stopped. Maybe he just got better at hiding it. Samuel did not sleep that night. He lay in darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling. But now every creak and whisper seemed sinister. The walls that had witnessed so many secrets were themselves a secret. A machine designed for conspiracy, operating in plain sight for 66 years. If Ruth was right, then those crates in the barn didn't contain machinery parts. They contained something far more valuable and terrible. But Samuel needed proof. Suspicions and stolen conversations weren't enough. If he was going to act on what he knew, and the fact that he was even considering action terrified him, he needed concrete evidence. Over the next week, Samuel became obsessed with the acoustic network. He would lie in his room at night, ear pressed to that crack in the plaster, listening to Mistress Garrett's private conversations with her visiting friends. He learned about debts and social rivalries, about her growing concern over her husband's business problems, about her suspicion that something at Riverside was not quite proper. From his listening post in the linen closet, he heard Master Garrett arguing with Mr. Bennet about security. "I want every field hand accounted for at night. Any unexplained absence gets reported immediately, and make sure the new woman, Ruth, is never left unsupervised in the main house." From the attic panel, he heard a conversation between two of Master Garrett's business associates from Savannah. "The Charleston matter is nearly resolved. Senator Williams managed to suppress the investigation. As long as the federal inspector never sees the manifest from 47 to 52, we're protected." Each fragment was damning, but fragmentary. Samuel needed to access those crates in the barn. He needed to know what they actually contained. His opportunity came on a humid Saturday in late April. Master Garrett left Riverside early that morning, heading to Augusta for what he claimed would be a 3-day trip. Mistress Garrett took the opportunity to visit her sister in Mon, taking the household's senior staff with her. This left the plantation under Mr. Bennet's supervision, but Bennet was lazy and spent most of his time in the overseer's cottage on the far side of the property. Samuel waited until afternoon when the field hands were spread across the cotton acreage and the remaining house staff were occupied with their usual tasks. Then he took his tools and walked calmly toward the east barn as if he had business there. The new padlock was formidable, but the barn's construction was not. Samuel found a loose board near the back wall and used his pry bar to create a gap just wide enough to squeeze through. Inside the crates were exactly where he'd seen them on the night of the delivery, stacked against the far wall. Samuel approached the nearest one and examined it carefully. The wood was fresh pine assembled recently. The stentled marking machinery parts, Savannah Foundry, was actually a stamp applied with a rubber seal that had left slightly smudged edges. These crates had been marked deliberately to look legitimate, but they were not legitimate shipments. Samuel selected a crate from the middle of the stack and used his pry bar carefully to loosen the nailed lid. The wood creaked as it came free, loud in the still barn. He paused, listening, but heard only the distant sounds of the plantation at work. Inside the crate was cloth, heavy canvas folded multiple times. Samuel lifted the layers carefully and felt his breath stop. Beneath the canvas were manacles, dozens of them, all new, still wrapped in oiled paper to prevent rust. And beneath the manacles were documents, printed handbills, advertising rewards for runaway slaves, blank certificates of ownership, and several official-looking forms from various county clerk's offices in South Carolina and Georgia. These were the tools of the slave-catching trade, the equipment necessary to capture, restrain, and provide false documentation for people who would then be sold at auction. But there was more. At the bottom of the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, was a ledger. Samuel lifted it out with shaking hands. The ledger was new, its pages still crisp, but the entries inside dated back several months. January 15th, 1857. 2 individuals secured in Philadelphia. Transport to Charleston arranged. Estimated value $1,800. February 3rd, 1857. 4 individuals secured in Richmond. High risk due to literacy. Transport delayed but completed February 18th. Estimated value $3,400. March 9th, 1857. 1 individual secured in Washington. Premium documentation required. Transport completed March 20th. Estimated value $1,200. The entries continued month after month, each one representing human beings kidnapped from freedom and sold back into slavery. And at the bottom of each entry was a notation, share to RMG, 30%. RMG, Robert Montgomery Garrett, Master Garrett himself. Samuel stood in the dim barn holding evidence of a conspiracy that stretched from Georgia to Pennsylvania, involving dozens of people over years. This wasn't just smuggling. This was a coordinated operation to kidnap free black people across the North and Upper South, forge documents claiming they were escaped slaves, and sell them at auction to plantations throughout the Deep South. And Riverside Manor, with its acoustic surveillance system, its hidden passages, its respectable facade, was at the center of it. Samuel returned the ledger to the crate and carefully replaced the lid, tapping the nails back into position. He slipped out of the barn the same way he had entered, replaced the loose board, and walked back to the main house with his tools, moving like a man underwater. His mind was screaming. Every instinct told him to forget what he had seemed to survive, to protect himself, to protect himself. What could one enslaved carpenter do against a conspiracy this large and this protected? Master Garrett had connections to senators and federal inspectors. The men involved in this operation were powerful enough to suppress investigations and track fugitives across state lines. But Samuel kept seeing those entries in the ledger: 2 individuals secured in Philadelphia, 4 individuals secured in Richmond. Each one represented people who had thought they were safe, who had built lives in freedom, only to be torn away and dragged south in chains. People like Ruth, who had made it all the way to Cincinnati before being captured and returned. People who were being erased from existence as if freedom had never touched them. That night, Samuel lay in his room and listened to the walls. The house whispered around him, distant conversations, footsteps on creaking boards, the small sounds of a structure settling under its own weight. But now he understood what he was hearing: the mechanism of silence, the architecture of secrets. This house had been built to keep conspiracies hidden, to allow terrible things to be planned and executed without witness. But someone was witnessing now. Around midnight, Ruth appeared at his door again. She looked exhausted, her hands raw from the harsh kitchen work she'd been assigned. "Did you find what you needed?" "Yes." Samuel's voice was hollow. "You were right, all of it. Then what are we going to do?" The question hung in the air. Samuel had been avoiding it, but now there was no escape. "What can we do? If I try to tell anyone, the county sheriff, a magistrate, they'll never believe me. I'm an enslaved man accusing one of the wealthiest planters in Georgia. They'd say I stole the documents, or forged them, or that I'm lying to cause trouble. What about someone in the North, an abolitionist newspaper? How would I even contact them? And even if I could, how long before Master Garrett found out, before I ended up dead in a field somewhere with everyone told I'd tried to run?" Ruth sank down against the wall. "So, we just let it continue? Let him keep destroying lives?" "I don't know." The words came out sharper than Samuel intended. He took a breath, forcing calm. "I need to think. There has to be a way, but I can't see it yet." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then the voices in the walls. "Master Garrett doesn't know you can hear them, does he?" "I don't think so." "Why? Because he still uses this house the way his grandfather did to coordinate things in secret, which means he'll talk about the operation. Maybe reveal something we can use, a name, a contact, something that could bring the whole thing down." Samuel understood what she was suggesting. "You want me to keep listening? I want us to be ready. Sooner or later, Master Garrett will make a mistake. He'll say something or do something that gives us leverage, and when that happens, we need to know enough to act." It was a desperate plan built on hope and patience that Samuel wasn't sure he possessed, but it was a plan. "All right," he said finally, "I'll listen." May arrived with oppressive heat and the constant hum of insects in the fields. Samuel moved through his days maintaining the careful facade of the unobtrusive servant, but his nights were spent pressed against the walls, listening. He heard Master Garrett arguing with his wife about finances, about the growing debts that threatened to consume Riverside's legitimate income. He heard Mistress Garrett pleading with her husband to abandon whatever dangerous enterprise you've involved yourself in before it destroyed them all. He heard Master Garrett meeting with his associates in the study, their voices rising through hidden channels to Samuel's listening post in the linen closet. The federal inspector has been reassigned to Louisiana. Senator Williams has confirmed it. We're clear. For now. What about the shipment scheduled for June? 4 acquisitions are already confirmed in Baltimore. 3 more are likely in Cincinnati. All documentation has been prepared. Hidden behind the walls, Samuel heard everything. He listened as Mr. Bennett reported to Master Garrett about an enslaved man from a nearby plantation, someone who had been asking questions about people who vanished without a trace. I spoke to his owner, Bennett said coldly. The man has been dealt with. He won't be asking questions anymore. Samuel burned those words into his memory. Conversation by conversation, he built a mental map of the conspiracy. Names, places, roles. A senator, James Williams, in Charleston. A lawyer named Preston, known for forged documents. A slave trader called Hull operating out of Richmond. A corrupt sheriff in Augusta who supplied false arrest warrants. Each secret Samuel overheard was proof of another crime. Another stolen life, another human being erased. And the worst part was this. He could do nothing but listen, remember, and endure. In mid-May, Ruth brought news that changed everything. They're planning something big, she whispered. Master Garrett and Mr. Bennett were talking. There's going to be a meeting here, at Riverside. All of them, every major figure involved. They're calling it the expansion. When? Samuel asked. The first week of June. Master Garrett is sending most of the staff away. He says there will be important guests and no interruptions. Her voice trembled. This might be our only chance, Ruth said. If we listen, then, we'll finally understand the full scope of what they're planning. Samuel nodded slowly. If we're going to do anything, he said quietly, it has to happen during that meeting. If you enjoy dark, hidden historical stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Rite Stories. Click the like button to support the channel and help bring these forgotten stories to light. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.